Okay, Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to tonight's webinar on 3 steps to healing your marriage. So a quick disclaimer, you can have a look at that. Basically, seek professional advice if you need that. And starting off with marriages. So it's normal to experience issues in our marriages. Whether you're newlywed or you've been married for decades, most people have ups and downs. It's a part of life to have ups and downs. So in our marriages, we have ups and downs too. When you experience problems, it can feel very isolating, and it feels like there's no way to heal from this place. In some cases, sadly, marriages end in a divorce. And that's not what any of us want, and no one gets married to get divorced. Let's get married to get divorced. We want our marriages and we want things to work. But how do we deal with hurt and pain? How do we deal with conflict? If you are experiencing marriage problems, go easy on yourself. Many of us haven't had any training in marriage, and many of us haven't seen good marriages growing up. So it's inevitable that we're going to make mistakes, and we're going to make a lot of mistakes because of those things. We just get married one day and we're expected to know exactly what to do without having had that training. Our spouse is going to hurt us. We're going to make mistakes. They're going to hurt us, and we're going to hurt them, and they're going to make mistakes. We know in the Quran, in Surah Mulk, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the one who created death and life so that he may test you as to which one of you is better in his deeds, and he is the Almighty, the most forgiving. Life and death is a test for us, and it's here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is testing us in our daily life, in our work, in our homes, in our marriages, dealing with all these relationships. Life is a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's trial and hardships. So when you experience hardships in your marriages, don't be disheartened that this shouldn't be happening. This isn't how it's supposed to be. We go on social media, everyone looks happy. Everyone looks like they're all having a happy marriage. The truth is a lot of people don't hang their dirty laundry out. So we don't really know what they're going through. A lot of people look really happy, but actually they're not. And I'm sure you might have seen it in your own friends. You've got a friend and you know she's not really happy in a marriage, but on her social media, she looks like she's got the happiest marriage in the world. So we know this is the case. In a hadith, it says, wondrous is the affair of a believer, as there is good for him in every matter. This is not the case for anyone but a believer. If he experiences pleasure, he thanks Allah, and it is good for him. If he experiences harm, he shows patience, and it is good for him. So let's get started with these 3 steps. Number 1 is making the right intention. Making an intention for marriage can be transformational. So when we intend something for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it helps us to approach that task with sincerity and humility. We begin that action by adopting taqwa, so we are mindful of our behavior and how we conduct ourselves towards our spouse. And we also, when we make that intention for the sake of Allah Almighty, we remind ourselves, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching us. He can see how we're treating our spouse. He can see how we talk to them. Often, people have a belief that it's okay to treat people at home however you like. So as long as you go to work and when you're in a professional environment, you're nice to people and you're calm, and at work you wouldn't shout and scream because no one would employ you. And that's how you have to be outside, fake and nice. I'm not saying we aren't nice, but on your best behavior. And when you come home, it's okay to just lash out, say mean, horrible things. But if our work colleagues saw us like that, we'd be embarrassed. If people saw us making a video, if people made a video of us at home and put it on TikTok or YouTube, we might be embarrassed. And what about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What about the fact that He can see how we are? So we want to make that intention for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we know, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, I did not create the jinns and human beings except for the purpose that they should worship me. Marriage is worship. So we make that intention for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're getting married, and we're married to this person for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that shapes our actions, and it affects the outcomes, because how we act will affect the outcome of those. And we want to really emphasize that sincere intention. It creates humility. So you might be about to shout at your spouse. You might be about to be mean to them or say something to them. And then you remind yourself, this is for the sake of Allah Almighty. He's watching me, and you're humble. It's a sacred act, and we mute the ego. So when you intend a marriage for the sake of Allah Almighty, you might wish to include some of the following. I intend to please Allah Almighty through this marriage. I will love you for the sake of Allah Almighty. And we know when people love each other for the sake of Allah Almighty, they will get His shade on the day of judgment. I intend to display good character to you for the sake of Allah Almighty. I intend to build a good marriage for the sake of Allah Almighty. I intend to build a base that will give us both sakina. Sakina is peace. And when we have this peace in our lives, in our homes, in our marriage, we can do a lot of things with that. We can worship Allah Almighty. Imagine your prayer when you've just had an argument with your spouse and you've insulted them and they've insulted you, and you've been mean and they've been mean, and now it's time for Maghrib and you're getting up to pray. What is your salah like? Are you concentrating? Are you feeling humble? Are you feeling close to Allah Almighty? And how many salahs will be affected after an argument? So after one argument, how long will you ruminate over that argument for? How many days is your salah affected for? And then it's time for the next argument. And now another few days with your salah being affected by that. And now imagine that you've had a peaceful few days with your spouse. You've been kind to them. You've had a loving relationship for a few days. And now you're about to pray. And now imagine how you approach that prayer and how precious that inner tranquility really is. And I intend a marriage that will last the dunya and the akhirah. You know, in Jannah, inshallah, we're going to have spouses and partners. And we hope that, well, we build a happy marriage here. It can last beyond the dunya. And I intend for this marriage, if you intend to have children, I intend to build a home to raise righteous children. I intend to model a good marriage for my community and children. The more marriages we see that are good marriages, we are also helping our community. We're helping our children to build good marriages, because now our children can grow up and they can say, I've seen a good marriage. Maybe some of you have seen a good marriage, but most of the people I know haven't seen good marriages growing up. So we're building good marriages for our community. They can model our marriage. They can ask us for advice. We can help guide them on how to build a good marriage. And I intend to instill the love of Islam into my children's hearts through this marriage. If you have a good marriage where you treat your spouse well, and there is love and tranquility and peace in this household, you are showing your children Islam. So it doesn't make sense when we tell our children Islam means peace. And Islam, we are loving, caring people. Don't believe what the news says. Don't believe that. Don't believe this. We are loving, caring people. And we're trying to tell our children this. But when they see their parents and how their mom and dad treats each other, and they're seeing the insults and they're seeing the abuse and they're seeing bad character, and then we tell them Islam's about peace. Look, we're just people. What are those children going to believe as they grow up? What are they going to believe about a Muslim woman and a Muslim man? And what kind of spouse are they going to want? Are they going to want a religious spouse? Are they going to be drawn to Islam? Are their hearts going to have love for the deen? Or is it going to turn them away? And this is a responsibility that we have. So marriage is dawah. We're giving dawah. We often think of dawah, you're setting up a stall, you've got your leaflets and you're inviting people to Islam. And that is dawah. And there's also dawah taking place in the home. So when you are a wife, you are giving dawah to your husband about what a Muslim woman is. And your husband, he's giving dawah to his wife. And there's probably more responsibility on him as the leader of a family to give dawah to his wife. This is what a Muslim man stands for. These are Islamic values. I am showing my family the beauty of Islam. And continuing with our intentions for this marriage, I intend to build a strong unit that forms part of a wider community and a healthy ummah. And I intend to build a home that serves the ummah. When we look at the state of the ummah, we all think we want a strong ummah. We want this ummah to be strong. We want Muslims to be strong people. We see what's happening in Palestine. We see what's happening in Gaza. And we think, why can't the Muslims be strong? Why can't they stand together? Why can't they help each other? And the ummah is made of individuals. The ummah is made of families. Your family is contributing to the state of the ummah. And when we have a strong family, we can then serve the ummah from this place. So if a husband and wife have a strong marriage and a happy marriage, they're able to raise money for Palestine, raise money for the ummah, wherever they're suffering, talk about these issues, go on marches, do whatever else they want to do, give in charity. But if they're busy arguing and insulting each other, and there's so much stress and trauma at home, there's not much energy to serve the community, that's Muslims, that's non-Muslims, in whatever way you'd want to. So there's a lot of intentions for a happy marriage. How many times have you made du'as for your marriage? Just a question. You can think about it. You can type the answer if you like in the chat. What would your marriage look like if in 3 to 6 months you made this daily intention for your marriage that we've just gone through? And you can adapt it. You can make your own intention. And you can keep it briefer if you're doing it on a daily basis. But you made that intention. This marriage is for the sake of Allah Almighty. And you made dua for your marriage. What would your marriage look like in 3 to 6 months' time? Making the intention every day helps bring our mind into the present moment. Without this conscious effort, our mind often wanders into the past or into the future. The present moment is a healthy place to be. And in psychology, we talk about grounding as a way to help people deal with anxiety and depression. So we want to be present. Being present is a healthy way to be. Doing dhikr, praying salah, is training our minds to be present and to be connected to Allah Almighty. When it goes into the past, what happens? We often feel hurt. We ruminate about our grudges. We ruminate about our pain, our childhood, whatever adversity we've faced. And when we're going into the future, our minds wandering into the future, we might worry about things, worry about money, worry about other things. And when we are right now, just in the present moment, focused on now, focused on gratitude, focused on taqwa, this is a healthy place for our minds to be. Being mindful and grateful and doing dhikr trains our mind to be present right now. Every day, we are either improving our marriages or we're regressing it as individuals and also in our marriages. Many people often feel that even if my marriage isn't quite where I want it to be, I'm okay to live dysfunctionally. I'm okay that I'm not very nice to my husband. I'm okay that he's not very nice to me. We can just live because it's cheaper to just live in the same household. It's easier. There's less stigma. Less people are going to ask questions. I don't want that issue of people getting, us getting divorced and having all those extra issues. But I don't really want to fix my issues either. I'm okay with just living dysfunctionally. You can even have your own part of the house. I'll have my part of the house, and we just live our own lives separately. Some people are happy to live dysfunctionally. It's not necessarily Islamic, because we know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching us and we should live in a way that is pleasing to him. But some people live like this. And I just want to point out that marriage isn't like a piece of paper that you leave on the table and you come back to it in a few days' time and it's exactly where you left it. So if you don't want to fix your problems and you're happy living dysfunctionally, you can't guarantee that your spouse is happy with that. And if you think back to what your intention was for marriages, is that what you'd want? Are these the kind of standards you want for your ibadah? To just have dysfunctional ibadah? Are those acceptable standards for you? Marriage is a dynamic relationship. It's constantly changing. People have rights and responsibilities. And if we neglect those responsibilities, the love can erode away and resentment takes its place. And spouses can become oblivious as to how distant they're really coming. Because if you're not communicating, you don't really know what your spouse is thinking, what's going on, and whether they're moving further away, whether they're thinking of leaving, for example. And people do get caught out. So I just wanted to point this out. One person might think it's okay to live dysfunctionally, the other person isn't. And each day they're growing apart. And one day someone decides, that's it, I don't want to be part of this anymore. I'm not loved. I don't have any of my rights fulfilled here. I don't feel like I've got self-worth living in this relationship. And I actually want to leave. Divorce is not a mutually agreed decision. It's not where both people come together and say, this isn't working, I think it's time to split up. I mean, you don't agree on anything else. Are you really going to agree on getting divorced? So divorce is usually when one person wants to leave, and it's usually, and this may surprise a lot of us, the woman. I once spoke to a lady and she was discussing with me that her husband just left. I think they were married for about 20 years. And one day her husband just left. And she was very bitter and very annoyed and very angry about this, like anyone would be. But when I tried to ask her, I said, there must have been something going on, something that he just got up and left. She just kept saying, no, there was nothing. Everything was fine. And maybe it was. Maybe everything was fine. But I would assume that it wasn't. The most likelihood scenario is that everything wasn't fine. but people ignore their problems. They've got their head in the sand. They don't want someone to want to fix their problems because it's difficult to fix our problems, and we don't know how to fix our problems, and we just ignore them sometimes. And they might snowball and become bigger and bigger, and we don't realize that. In a book called Atomic Habits, some of you may have read it, by Dr. James Clear, he talks about improving 1% every single day. And he says if you can build healthy habits, you can aim at improving your life at 1% each day. And at the end of the year, you will be 37 times better. And if you were to get worse by 1%, you would reach 0. Improvement is an active process. It doesn't just happen. Whereas if you don't do anything, you get worse by default. So the default position is that things are getting worse every day. If the active position is that you are putting something into this and you are improving every day. And if we were to apply his principle to marriages, what would we see? So every day, your marriage is either getting 1% better or it's getting a little bit worse. And after a year, your marriage can be 37.78 times better, so 38 times better, or it can be at virtually 0, depending on the choices you make every single day. Interestingly, in this research paper, they asked people who got divorced what should have happened, who should have done more, and they asked partners if they should have worked harder to save their marriages. So they asked them, should your partner have done more to save the marriage? And the majority of men and women, so 65.8% of men, 73.8% of women, believe their ex-spouse should have worked harder to save their marriage. And when they asked the question the other way around, should you personally have worked harder to save your marriage? 31.6% of men said yes, and 33.3% of women said so 31.6% of men said, yes, I should have worked harder. And 33.3% of women said, yes, I should have worked harder. So the majority of people were blaming the other person. And the minority of people were saying, I should have done more. So everybody blames the other person. And sometimes that is justified. But it's interesting to note that that's the majority of cases. And in healthy relationships, so the person's not doing drugs and things like that, this approach of the other person needs to change doesn't really help us. So in most marriages, that mindset doesn't help us. If you want your marriage to work, you need to look at what you can do. So summary of step 1 is make the intention and do daily du'as for your marriage. So after every salah, for example, make that intention for your marriage. Step number 2 is fulfilling each other's rights. So it might sound quite formal, that marriage, and not as lovey-dovey as we like to hear, but marriage is a contract. And that means the husband must fulfill his wife's rights, and the wife likewise must fulfill the husband's rights. These are sacred and cherished rights. They come from Allah Almighty. So these rights are outlined by the Islamic law, and they need to be honored for a successful marriage. And we need to understand these rights and uphold them. When people's rights are not fulfilled, they become resentful and hurt. And they have a right to become resentful and hurt, because Islam tells us these are the person's rights, this is what they're owed. And if people don't get what they're supposed to get, they're going to feel hurt. What are your spouse's rights? So have a think for a moment. What are your spouse's rights? And are these being fulfilled? And if they're not being fulfilled, you might find someone who's hurt, bitter, resentful, and angry. Many people give their spouse what they want to give them, or they fulfill their rights when they're in the mood. So I'm in the mood to fulfill your rights. I'm in the mood of being nice to you today, but tomorrow I might not feel like it. And might not feel like fulfilling your rights. The husband might think, I'm happy to pay for something for my wife today. I don't feel like doing it anymore. I don't feel like providing for her financially anymore. So this inconsistency isn't fulfilling people's rights. And it's not up to us to decide, do I want to fulfill them or not, really? So, we all have reasons sometimes where we can't do them, health reasons or other reasons, and we need to be flexible. But in the majority of the time, are you fulfilling your spouse's rights or not? And taqwa reminds us to fulfill these rights and be God-fearing, and it's not a tit-for-tat attitude. Well, he's being nice, so I'll be nice. Well, actually, Allah Almighty is watching you, and how do you want to behave? So we don't want to keep these tally charts and only fulfill our side if they fulfill their side. Often spouses are waiting for the other person to change, and there's so much hurt and so much resentment, and people are so, they don't want to hear it, that I might need to do something. And even some of you might be listening and thinking, that's not what I want to hear. Some people might be bringing their spouses to tonight's meeting, hoping, I hope he hears what she's got to say, and I hope he takes note. I hope she takes note and listens and changes. And an example of someone I spoke to once, a lot of the time I'm taking ladies' example just because I happen to speak to them more. But obviously men have issues and things and complaints too. So one lady I was speaking to, and she was telling me how her husband shouts a lot and shouts at her pretty much every day and insults her and insults her family. And I was listening to her and it sounded terrible, all the things she was telling me. And I asked her, I said, well, when he's saying these horrible things to you, what are you doing? And she said, well, I'm shouting at him. So I thought that was very interesting. And she was shouting at him and insulting his family. So I said to her, what would happen if you didn't insult him and his family? What if you didn't shout at him? And she said, he'd stop shouting at me. So an interesting thing, and we actually know the answers to some of these things. And sometimes we need to change our behavior to see a response in how they behave. So consider each other's rights, study the fiqh of these rights, and there's Islamic details regarding rights that a husband and wife have. There's rights to finances, there's rights to intimacy, rights to be treated kindly, rights to be respected. Men need respect. We often hear this, and it goes around in circles because the wife will say, well, he needs to earn that respect. And it just happens to be the case that if a man feels respected, he generally becomes more confident and he becomes better at making decisions. He becomes better at leading a family, and he actually becomes worthy of that respect. I'm not saying he wasn't worthy of that respect initially. I'm just explaining that it's almost like a cycle, that when the man gets respected, he almost becomes that husband that the wife wants. Maybe he's got issues with his self-esteem and he's not able to live in a way that is showing a confident man. But if he's got a wife who believes in him, who stands by him, who cheers him on, what's he going to be like in a few months' time? Maybe he's never had that. Maybe he's never experienced the love and support of someone who stands by him, even when he doesn't make the right decisions. But a few months of having that encouragement, that love, that support, that unconditional love and support, what will it do to that man? What will it do for him? And likewise, the wife. Women need love. And when women receive love, what happens to them? The husband comes along, he tells his wife how much he loves her. He tells her how nice she looks and how lovely she is in her character and the nice things she might have said to him. And he gives her that positive reinforcement. What happens? Well, she'll melt. And she will become that caring, loving wife, even if she wasn't necessarily. She will change. So when people's cups are full, they do have more to give. But we're almost waiting for the other person to change. And if we can start filling other people's cups with fulfilling their emotional needs, we might find that that positivity comes back. Discussing intimacy. So mental health can affect people's libidos and it can affect people's intimacy levels. And that could be something that's affecting people's marriages. Just as a thought, it's not something we think about a lot. It's just you're married and that's their rights and you need to do something with it. But if people are struggling with that right, if you're struggling in any way, then consider, is it your energy levels affected? Could it be your mental health related? Could it be medication? For example, antidepressants can cause sexual dysfunction even after people have stopped them. So just consider what might be going on. But on the emotional side, if spouses are not fulfilling each other's intimate needs, then people can start feeling unloved. They feel unattracted and they feel rejected. It's not just about a physical need. There's a lot of emotions that come with this. So the person feels rejected and it breeds resentment. And as Muslims, people are protecting themselves from haram outlets and haram relationships, and they only have their spouse. And when their spouse rejects them, it causes a lot of pain. And it's something to just that everyone needs to think about If it's an issue for you, then have a think about it and think about what the underlying issues might be and consider how you might approach and change things there. So 2 steps: make the intention and fulfill each other's rights. And now we're going to talk about step 3. Learn to emotionally regulate yourself. Emotional dysfunction can be the result of childhood adversity. It can also be the result of not being taught this skill. Emotional regulation is something that we learn. We learn how to regulate our emotions by seeing healthy adults regulate their emotions. Sometimes you see parents and they've got children and they're expecting their children to know how to regulate themselves. So they go shopping, the child wants a toy, the mom says no, he starts having a tantrum, and the mom's shouting at him, "What's wrong with you? Why are you like this?" I'm just taking the mom, it could be the father or two. The father shouting at the child, "What's wrong with you? Why can't you just accept it, that you're not getting the toy this time?" And people almost assume that children are going to have emotional regulation, healthy emotional responses. It's not something that we have. It's something we're taught. Many of us carry emotional baggage from our past, and we easily get triggered. We say and do things to our spouse, and in turn, they say and do things to us. So over time, when we say and do things to our spouse which aren't kind, this causes hurt and pain, and it erodes the love in the relationships, and couples tear apart. It happens over time. It doesn't happen over one argument. It happens gradually. By healing our emotional baggage, we can build love and respect into our marriages and create a healthier emotional environment for our relationships to strive. And sometimes we hear marriage advice and it will say, well, don't say that to your husband, and husbands talk, well, don't say anything that to your wife, or don't wear that color, that will upset him, and don't speak that, that will just trigger him. And these might be perfectly normal things, and don't do this and don't do that, and that they'll get triggered. And we're sort of taught not to trigger your spouse. And I sort of feel like we need to be looking a bit deeper, because we shouldn't be walking on eggshells. We want to build healthy emotional responses, not living a life where we get triggered constantly by our spouse and they get constantly triggered by us. And now we've got all these rules to live by. We want to develop emotional regulation and develop a mature response to situations, not be throwing tantrums like young children might be when they don't get what they want. So unless we reflect and we develop ourselves, our response will still reflect how we responded in our childhoods. So sometimes we develop emotional regulation with time just by having experiences, but a lot of the time, if you see people shouting and screaming and insulting their spouse, it does look like quite an early emotional response. If we don't address our emotional baggage, we won't know how to handle unwanted thoughts, and it's more difficult to be grateful. So we start getting these thoughts about our spouse. Oh, he's done this and he said that and he said this and he said that. And we don't let go of grudges. We don't let go of resentment. We don't move on. There was one couple I worked with and they didn't consummate the marriage on the wedding night. The wife was a bit, shy and reluctant. She's never been in a relationship before. And it took a few weeks till she felt comfortable. And years later, the husband is still resentful and annoyed and irritated with his wife for that. And it was still causing marital issues years later for them. So we really want to be able to heal from our emotional baggage, not get triggered and not feel this is our, we've got a lack of self-esteem. We've got all these trigger buttons and they get triggered and that's it. We're never going to be able to move on. We're never going to forgive our spouse for anything they've said or done. We don't want to entertain these negative thoughts towards our spouse. We want to see the good things that they do for us. Because when we get triggered, we're living in the past, remember how he was then, remember all the things she said then, even if it was years ago, or we're worried about the future. And we're just so worried about what will happen. We experience depression, we experience anxiety, and we're not the best version of ourselves. And this is how couples might be. Now, they've often got their own unhealed emotional triggers going on. People themselves feel hopeless. They don't feel that they're good or lovable. They feel they're ugly. The husband might just say something, and the emotional response from the wife was just triggered. It was just disproportionate to what actually happened. The same thing with the husband. The wife just said something, maybe she didn't, the food was like this or something like that, or she said something and he just got triggered. And the response was completely disproportionate because he's got all these wounds, and he needs to heal from those to bring a healthy version of himself to this marriage. How many of you have felt that your spouse has acted immaturely and maybe said mean things to you or done mean things, acted in that way? And how many times do you think you've acted immaturely towards your spouse? And what does that do to your marriage? So if we don't work on our emotional well-being, we carry our childhood baggage and responses into our marriages. And this is a major issue. I think this is probably the most important issue that I see going on with marriages. Sometimes people come to a talk, they come to an Islamic talk, and for a few days they hear some lecture and advice about being good to your spouse, and for a few days they're good to this for their spouses, and it does help. But in the long term, they're not able to change their behaviors because their behavior is based on this baggage, and there's deeper work that needs to be done. And when we do that deeper work, we can get some better results. So the ACE study, we talked about this in our last session, shows how childhood adversity can affect our physical and mental well-being as adults, and trauma can affect our mental health as adults. So if you have experienced childhood adversity, this is going to affect you as an adult. It's going to affect your levels of anxiety, depression. You might not have clinical anxiety and depression. It might not score majorly on the scores. You might still be functional and able to go to work, but it's going to affect our behavior and our character as adults, because it's affected us. It's affected our physical health and our mental health. So think about your ACE score. Think about what score you've got. And if you haven't worked out your score, we went through it in last week's presentation, so you can go through the recording. It's on YouTube. And think about your ACE score and think about how that affects your marriage. Think about what your spouse's ACE score is, and it might help, because when you think about your ACE score and their ACE score, you might be more compassionate to yourself, that actually I am struggling here and I am finding it difficult and I am getting triggered and it does feel quite overwhelming. And it's not that I'm not trying. I'm trying to be a good person. I'm trying to be patient. I really am trying to be caring, but it just feels like there's something inside me that just gets triggered, and it's so deep, and there are these wounds I've got. And I think we need to acknowledge that people do have these wounds and they do have these triggers. And if we want a lasting response, we need to have a deeper approach to our problems. And consider, did either of you have a trustworthy adult in your life that helped buffer you from adversity? Because the research also shows that people who had a trustworthy adult in their life were protected from trauma. And it didn't affect them physically and mentally as much as it did the people that didn't. And think about yourself and your own marriage, and whether you are, even if things aren't so good, and even if some people's marriages haven't worked out, you're not doomed. And don't think, oh, that's it because of the ACE score, because maybe we got divorced before my kids were 18. That means that my children, they're going to affect this and they're going to affect that. No, Allah Almighty is very merciful. And if there's one adult that those children have who have good mental health and are there for that child and protecting that child, they are protected from that trauma. And I think that's really reassuring for us to know that one adult can do a lot. But often what happens is when there's a divorce or when there's trauma like that, like separation, or one parent has a mental illness, the child ends up losing both parents, because the other parent who didn't have those issues is almost chasing the parent who had the mental illness, chasing them around, trying to get them to be that functional parent. It's different to supporting them. And often they are so triggered by the situation themselves that the child often ends up losing both parents being present, being protectors for them. So most people say they want to marry someone easygoing. So coming back to our triggers and how easygoing, Is it something that you want? Often if we apply for jobs, people often say, I want someone easygoing. It's something you might get asked at interviews about. No one wants to work with uptight people. No one wants to be married to an uptight person who is constantly triggered. Does anybody want that? So how easygoing are you? And this is within an Islamic framework. So we're thinking within the Islamic framework of whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed us to do, and within that flexibility, how easygoing are you? Out of 10, where 10 is very easygoing, whereabout are you? 0 to 10, where would you mark yourself? How easygoing are you? So give yourself a score just for some self-reflection. And what would your spouse say about you? What would they say your score was? How easygoing do they think you are? More importantly than your own assessment. So you might give yourself a score of 7, 8 up there. Are they going to give you a score of 7, 8, or are they going to give you a score of 3 and 4? And what about your spouse? Whereabout are they? Are they at number 10? Are they at 0? Are you walking on eggshells around them? Whereabout is your spouse? So what's it like living with someone who's constantly triggered? It's like walking on eggshells, and it causes anxiety in people. We're not sure what's going to trigger us, what's going to trigger them. We're not sure what's going to trigger them today, and it feels like it's unpredictable, and it feels unsafe. That kind of environment doesn't feel safe. We need internal peace to worship Allah Almighty and live an Islamic life. Many of us haven't had this. So many people in the world of, in the work of trauma, have lived through unpredictable childhoods, and now they get married, and if they had somewhere which was predictable and safe, they could heal, because that's what we need to heal, is that safe environment to switch off those oversensitive alarm systems. But if they're constantly triggered, they might even not notice there's a problem, because we're so used to dysfunction. We're so used to living with someone unpredictable. Maybe your parents were unpredictable. I'm not saying they didn't try their best. I'm sure many parents have tried their best. So we're compassionate and humble towards our parents, and they're the parents Allah Almighty gave to us. But maybe we were triggered as children, and maybe it just feels normal now when you're married, it just feels normal to be triggered. So we need that internal peace and external safety to heal from childhood adversity. Instead of healing, spouses are just triggering each other even more. And I've spoken to couples where the husband will say, my wife just reminds me of my mother. She's controlling, she's nagging, and she's putting me down. And it just feels like I'm living with that mother that traumatized me when I was a child. And I'm sure parents do a lot of good things. It's just sometimes the way our brains function, we tend to remember a lot of the adversity. And that's part of the healing process, to reflect on the good things too. And the wife might say, and my husband reminds me of my father. He just triggers me. And here's a little photograph. It's a bit amusing, but what do you mean just? So they've got a little sign, just married, and the husband's trying to make his wife happy by having this sign at the back of their car. And she's got triggered by it. And now she's triggered, and now he's triggered, and he's almost looking like he's too scared to move. And he's too worried to say anything that his wife might get triggered. And when people get triggered, it's often due to having low self-esteem. They often feel uncared for, unloved. If you look at her, she looks, like someone who's sensitive. She's not trying to hurt him, but she's got her own pain and her own wounds that haven't healed. And she's busy with that. He's looking at her, and she's oblivious to him. She's just caught up in her own pain and triggers, and she needs to heal from that. I know it's a funny cartoon. I saw it and I thought, actually, there's a lot gone into this cartoon. So consider how many rules you have for your spouse. They need to dress like this, food needs to be like this, there's rules for the car, there's rules for your family, and there's rules for everything. Consider how many rules you have for your spouse. Dress, food, whatever, car, family, everything. And we have enough rules. We've got the Sharia, we've got plenty of rules. And outside of that, we want to be flexible and easygoing. We are all entitled to have a preference for things, and in some cases, the preferences may be based on the Sharia. But how many of us are living in a way that, because our spouse gets triggered by everything, we have to live in this certain way? And what happens is, what trauma does is it causes a fight or flight response inside of ourselves. So we've got a hypersensitive state. So if anyone's had some childhood adversity, many people have, it can be parents, it can be teachers, it can be bullying. Maybe your parents were fine. You could have been bullied at school and faced adversity there. So you've You've got a trauma response where now you're very triggered, very easily triggered. Everything's a threat. And when you feel threatened, you're hypersensitive to that threat. You've got an overactive alarm system, and it's designed to protect you from harm, that now you react in a certain way. So you get triggered, you might fight. Your response might be that you fight your spouse, you might flight, you might run away, you might freeze, you might appease them, you might try and overly please your spouse now from that trauma response so you don't feel attacked by them. Focusing on the main two responses, the fight or flight. So we feel our spouse has triggered us by something they've done, so now we're arguing with them, we're abusing them to protect ourselves because we feel threatened by them. We might withdraw. Men maybe do this. They talk about men going to their caves. They don't want to talk to their wife. They want to ignore their wife, and they've built up a wall. And why have they built up a wall? It's so they feel safe and they don't feel triggered and they don't feel hurt because they're not able to deal with that. They don't have the self-esteem and strength to deal with it. What if you could heal and you wouldn't get triggered? What if you could laugh things off? What if you could just not take things so seriously? What would your relationship look like? Because if you don't heal, you might attack your spouse without meaning to. And consider for a moment when your spouse walks into the room. So you're sitting there and they walk into the room, just notice how you feel. Is this someone you feel safe around? Is it someone who supports you? Are they your rock? Are they cheering you on while the world is bringing you down? And how do they feel? How does your spouse feel when you walk into the room? Do they feel that someone who's come in who loves me and respects me, who overlooks my faults, they're grateful for me, or are they also walking on eggshells? So how we treat our spouse is ibadah. It's worship to Allah Almighty. And our ibadah reflects our level of taqwa. Our taqwa is a reflection of us being mindful, being present, and grateful to Allah Almighty. And this is a reflection of our emotional well-being. So when we are mentally and physically well, we are present, we're grateful, and we treat people well. It can also go the other way. Some people can heal through being more religious. Some people read Quran and they go to Islamic circles and they do dhikr and they develop the Islamic characters that way too. This is showing an iceberg of what often happens. So our external behavior is just a little bit of what might, what people can see. But underneath, there's a whole pile of emotional baggage. And if we're just dealing with the external behavior, so for example, a husband and wife might go to some therapy and the wife says, they ask, well, what's the problem? And she says, well, the problem is he always leaves the toothpaste cover off and he never puts the toothpaste lid back on. And that just triggers me. And so they say to the husband, can you just put the toothpaste cover on? And it's like, yeah, I can. So if we deal with these, they might think their problems are sorted. If we do deal with a superficial solution to a deeper problem, you will get a superficial, solution or response. If we want something stronger to turn things around, we need to look deeper. So what we want to do is ask that wife, why do you feel triggered? Why do you feel so hurt when your husband leaves the lid off the toothpaste? He should put the lid back on. It's hygienic, it's cleanliness, it's tidying up. But why do you feel so triggered by that? And she might say, I actually bought that toothpaste. I buy the toothpaste. I buy it with my money. And when he doesn't put that lid on, I feel really hurt and unloved, and it just triggers something. And actually, we're going a bit deeper. I know I've taken a simple example here, but often when we look at what triggers people, there's something far deeper that goes into it. And when we can start addressing those deeper and deeper issues, it might not bother that wife anymore that he leaves the toothpaste cover off. He should do it. It is the right thing to do. But it might not trigger her so much. And the same issues with the husband. So we all need to work on ourselves. We need to develop emotional regulation. We need to develop emotional maturity. And without this, our behavior changes, but it's in the short term. So for better results, this is what we need to do, almost like we talk about diabetes. Well, yeah, you can take the medication, it masks the problem, but if you really want to sort out your diabetes, you need to look at what you're eating. You need to look at the deeper issues. And with that, you can put your diabetes into remission. Nowadays, we know things like low-carb keto diets can do that, and people don't need to mask their symptoms with medication. So we need to have compassion for ourselves and our spouse. When we learn about trauma, it should develop compassion inside ourselves, understanding, and we're healing from trauma, and not just trauma from our own generations, but there's intergenerational trauma. There's evidence and research showing the DNA holds trauma from generations. So we're dealing with a lot more than we might realize. But healing is, alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made it available to us, and He has made it accessible and easy. And when we try, things are easier than we might realize. We want our marriages to work. We need to have forgiveness, self-compassion, and fix things. And inshallah, we will. Every day, you are voting for the type of life and marriage you want. And a summary of the 3 steps. Step 1, make the intention. Step 2, fulfill each other's rights. These are sacred rights from Allah Almighty. And number 3, develop emotional regulation. And there's just a disclaimer there again that this is simple advice, and for education, please find someone qualified to help you deal with your emotional issues. And this is general medical advice. It doesn't really cover things like drug, alcohol, mental health issues, harmful addictions, domestic violence, and those things. And stay in touch. We're on social media, so subscribe to our YouTube channel, WhatsApp, Telegram, Facebook, and join our email list. And